Great. Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program here at the Middle East Institute, and pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Transactional or Strategic, the Future of Russo-Iranian Relations. I will set the stage very quickly so we can start the discussion and hear from our panelists. Following Russia's military invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Moscow has deepened its relations with Iran in ways we haven't really seen before. It's happening in the area of military cooperation, including the supply of lethal drones from Iran to Russia. There are suggestions that ties will deepen in the economic area. As the two most sanctioned countries in the world, there are certainly reasons for them seeking to do so. And we might soon see more Iranian Russian policy coordination in the region from Syria to Afghanistan. The aim of this panel is to discuss three questions: what drives Iranian Russian relations, and what are their limits from the perspective of both Moscow and Tehran? Can this relationship finally move from a transactional to a strategic one, and can it be sustained? And finally, what do deeper Iranian relations mean for the rest of the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf states? To discuss these matters, MEI is delighted to welcome three outstanding experts. In the interest of time, I will introduce them by name and affiliation and alphabetically, but you can see their full bios on the page for this event on the Middle East Institute's website. First, we have Abdullah Babood, who is the chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and a visiting professor the School for International Liberal Studies at Waseda University. I tried my best to pronounce the name, and I think I might have gotten it. Next, we have Anna Borshchskaya, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Last but not least, we have Mahmoud Sarul Ghalam, who is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Finally, I encourage all of you to submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. Don't raise the hand, please. Use the Q&A feature. That way we can see you and we can bring as many of your questions into the conversation as possible. With all that said, let me start, and I'll start with Mahmoud with the first question. Mahmoud, please set the stage for us in terms of where we are today. Is it proper to say that this Iranian-Russian relations has entered a whole new chapter and there's a strategic convergence underway, or is that perhaps an oversell? Up to you, Mahmoud.
Thank you so much, Alex. Great to be here with you, and I'm very pleased to my colleagues to join us, Abdullah and Anna. On your question, let me start by saying that Iran and Russia over the last 2-3 decades have had a transactional relationship on energy, on limited economic relations, but mostly on nuclear and security defense matters. They have cooperated. But I think the critical moment arrived when the US during the Trump administration left the JCPOA agreement. At that time, the security and military circles in Iran kind of reached the conclusion that US politics is unstable, and that if there's going to be any reversal in the economic sanctions, Iran has to make mass concessions and also try to go about a different strategic path in its foreign policy performance in the Middle East region. So Iran was not prepared to do that, and also on that matter, the Rouhani government, going back about 7 years ago, was under the impression that if JCPOA is signed with the United States, then there will be spillover effects onto economic cooperation with the United States. Therefore, there will be changes in the American approach towards Iran. I think that was an illusion. Iran could not reach a nuclear agreement with the United States without changing its foreign policy approach. That kind of outmaneuvered the security and military circles in Iran. They were able to persuade all within the establishment in Iran that Iran cannot rely on the United States, and the pivot arrived, and Iran kind of shifted towards Russia. Now, on that note, there are a number of and a range of benefits for Iran by shifting from a transactional to a strategic relationship with Russia. First, there is the potential of energy joint ventures. I think that's going to be limited. There is no parallel with the Europeans and obviously with the Americans in the energy sector. And then there is the potential of military cooperation, which has expanded after the Ukrainian invasion. And then there is the UN veto power by Russia that gives some security guarantees to Iran in the event Europe and the United States move to a different stage of relationship with Iran. And then there is the cyber warfare techniques and digital surveillance tools that Russia provides Iran, particularly on its internal security. But having said that, I think there are two fundamental, far more strategic reasons why Iran has pivoted towards Moscow. One is Russia's willingness to share intelligence with Iran on US operations within Iran and in the proximity of Iran. That is so critical for regime security, for national security, and also internal security. And another element that has not been discussed much, which is, I think Russia is going to play an important role in the transition of power in Iran. Not only politically, but also perhaps in terms of security and intelligence in the future transition of power in Iran. That's going to be a critical moment. All of these elements provide both techniques for survival and also continuity of the political system in Iran.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Before I turn to Anna, and this is just a question because I'll come back to you in the next round, and I wanted to ask you to sort of build on what you just said. I mean, it seems to me that the Iranian leadership looks at Russia more or less as a very useful partner in terms of their political situation vis-a-vis the rest of the world. You mentioned intelligence sharing. But also in terms of perhaps the domestic succession process after Ali Khamenei. These, I mean, from a regime perspective, these seems to be very important, reasons to have closer relations with Moscow. And yet, when you look at the totality of commentaries in Iran, there is more or less, it seems to me, maybe not a consensus, but I feel a majority of the analysis still has deep reservations about this relationship with Russia. So why is it stuck? Why is public opinion is one thing, but I think a good part of the Iranian regime is also has questions about the utility of closer relations with Russia. And I just wanted to sort of tell us whether that is shifting to the likes of Hassan Rouhani, the so-called moderate faction. Are they also starting to change their views? We know the military establishment in Iran always has been pro-Russia, if you will, since '79. So, Mahmoud, if I could ask you to comment on that when I come back to you. And Anna, let me ask the question to you also. Again, is this a relationship that's still, from a Russian perspective now, transactional? It's useful for now because of Russia's challenges, or do you see the beginning of something that starts moving towards a strategic partnership that will not just be limited to one area or two, but actually deeper than that?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Mahmoud and Abdullah, and thank you to MEI for inviting me. In short, I think this relationship is taking on a more strategic character. But let me, and that's sort of my bottom line up front. But let me take a step back from that and explain that a little bit. If we take a broader historic view in terms of Russia-Iran relations over the last several centuries, they were, to say the least, complicated. Historically, these two countries fought wars, and the Persian Empire lost wars to Russia rather than the other way around.
Mhm.
So, in my understanding, at least, from the Iranian perspective, there was always a sense of fear and distrust of Russia, and that what you're describing is perhaps still reflected in public opinion polling in Iran. But from the Russian perspective, this view was not reciprocated. Again, because historically Russia tended to win, or rather than the other way around. And from a public opinion perspective now, there are few opinion polls as opposed to actions of the Russian government. But even from the public opinion polling perspective, I've looked at the Levada Center polling information, which is still the most trustworthy pollster in Russia. They were labeled as a foreign agent. And although there are no polls that I've seen that go back, that start that were taken after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine polls just don't show a particular gap in terms of Russian state view versus the Russian public view. Small numbers tended to see Iran as among many friendly countries to Russia. If we go back to earlier years, when it came to the negotiations on the Iranian nuclear program, public opinion was split about whether Russia should continue to support Iran. But over the years, distrust of the United States and perception of the United States as the hostile power had ultimately taken over. And you're seeing that trajectory very clearly over the last, certainly the last decade, and especially that view accelerated in recent years prior to the invasion of Ukraine. To go back to the original point, why is this relationship, in my view, taking on a more strategic character? Because historically there's been so much distrust between these two countries. It's been difficult for analysts to assign a more strategic character to this relationship. But if we look at actions of the Russian state, even prior to the invasion of Ukraine, on the one hand, the Russian government tried to play mediator across the Middle East, and it positioned itself as somebody that could talk to all sides, including Iran and Israel, somebody that could host Hezbollah and Hamas, for example. So this position of a mediator in the Middle East was especially important to Vladimir Putin. But the fact of the matter is, rhetoric aside, Russia's actions always tilted more in favor of anti-American forces in the Middle East, and those were Iran and Syria. Now, if we look at what happened post-Ukraine invasion, Russia, for the first time, found itself in a position of reliance on Iran. That this has never happened. And if we look at what actions the Russian government has taken, they have to do with convergence of even the banking currencies, banking sector, the accelerated efforts in bolstering the north-south corridor. And that has to do with, as you said, Russia and Iran are the two most sanctions countries in the world now, and both need each other to circumvent Western sanctions. From a Russian perspective in particular, what the situation means is that American efforts to isolate Russia globally after its invasion of Ukraine are not working. In other words, Russia is primarily isolated in the West. But when it comes to the so-called global South, including Iran, Russia needs this space to stay afloat. And because Russia is now dependent on Iran, it is willing to share information. It is willing to provide a lot more than it was willing to do before. But it also has to do with memberships in institutions. For example, Iran, along with Saudi Arabia, has applied to be part of the BRICS. Other regional institutions such as the CSO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Iran for years had tried to become a member, and it was actually China rather than Russia that resisted Iranian membership. So the institutionalization of this relationship is another factor that points to the strategic nature of the relationship. Certainly in Syria, there has been no meaningful change in terms of Russian involvement in Russia's collaboration with Iran. So across the board of in the South Caucasus as well, you're seeing, and perhaps it's something we can get into Q&A, but across a number of key strategic regions, you're seeing a deepening of Russia-Iran relationship that has already been on an upwards trajectory before the Ukraine invasion, but has accelerated now post-Ukraine invasion.
Great, thank you so much, and I love you to I love it if you could touch more on the sort of practical change this one might have seen since the Ukraine war in terms of the broader Middle East. You mentioned Syria. From we can tell that the Israelis are still able to take out what they consider to be Iranian assets or pro-Iran assets. And for the longest of time, the Iranian complaint has been that the Russians are supposed to take care of the airspace over Syria, and the fact that they don't stop the Israelis is because the Russians are not trustworthy. Has anything there changed in Syria? You mentioned it hasn't, but maybe you want to add to it, and or maybe take it to South Caucasus, where I think we've seen Iranian disappointment in the last couple of years in Russia's role in that part of the world. The Iranians think that what is happening in the South Caucasus is to their disadvantage. But do they blame that in any way on Russian policies, for example, withdrawing support from Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan? Again, I know you've worked on South Caucasus, and if you could put it in the context of Iranian-Russian cooperation or rivalry, I think that would be very useful. I'll come back to you on that. And Abdullah, last but not least, please tell us, you are a keen, scholar and watcher on Arab, perspectives. And how would you say the Gulf states, or the broadly speaking, the Arab world, are reacting to what is going on in Iranian-Russian relations? Do they see this as something that is benign, perhaps a positive development, or do they see anything that might endanger Arab interest in the Middle East and beyond, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank MEI for this kind invitation to be in this distinguished panel with Mahmoud and Anna. It's a real pleasure. From Middle East perspective, from the Arab perspective, obviously they are watching what is going on. The changes that are taking place in the the dynamics in the global politics are quite intriguing. They're seeing that, of course, there is a US more focus on the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East is less important to them, or at least that is what is being perceived. If it is the real thing or not is an open to question, but that is how they perceive it. And there are certain indicators that shows that the US is less committed to the security of especially the Gulf states, but also to the Middle East, as it started to show its focus on focus on the Indo-Pacific and China in particular. What is happening in the Ukraine crisis is, of course, has changed a lot of the perception in many ways. And what this war is going, and how is it going to end, is going to also make a big difference in how the Middle East is, going to see this and see this relationship. Obviously, to answer directly your question, the Russian-Iranian rapprochement or relations, which is not yet strategic, but I agree with Anna, it could lead to that. There are some very deep collaboration that we are seeing happening in many respects that Mahmoud had also mentioned at different levels, whether economy, politics, security, cyber collaboration, technological collaboration. All of that kind of raises the eyebrows in the Arab countries, and to what extent this is going to go, and what kind of an effect is it going to have on the region. Obviously, the strategic agreement between Russia and Iran is an issue. The idea that that Russia might supply arms and missiles to and help Iran in developing its own military industry is a big issue. The idea that Russia might even supply fighter aircrafts to Iran is alarming to the Gulf states and to the region as a whole. So in a sense, there is apprehension about what is going on, and this is perhaps explains what is happening now in the region. What we are seeing is that the Gulf states, the Arab states, are trying to placate Russia, trying to keep Russia close to them, and not trying to antagonize Russia in many ways, to keep it away from Iran as much as possible, or at least to balance the relationship. So that is one reason why, a reason that explains why the Arab states are not necessarily supporting the Western efforts in the war. Although when we say that, there are, of course, differences and nuances in that in many ways. But in general, there is, both at the public level and also at the official level, we are seeing that there is a lot of sympathy with Russia. And we are seeing that, of course, there is a lot of apprehension about this relationship with Iran. And that also explains to a certain extent why Saudi Arabia has chosen to enter into an agreement with Iran, because it's part of the strategy basically to contain Iran and to have cooperation instead of conflictual relations that had existed for the last decades or so. And this way, at least they can try and avoid entering into a conflict. On one hand, trying to balance the relationship with Russia vis-a-vis Iran, and on the other hand, trying to get Iran close and enter into a cooperative agreement with them, so that they try and avoid any conflicts or wars. So in general, there is a lot of apprehension, of course, which explains why the Gulf states and the Arab states in general have not sided with the United States or Europe and the West in this. And of course, they keep saying that when Ukraine war started, you wanted us to be with you, but we've had so many of our conflicts in the region, and where were you when we needed you? And of course, this is also just to end up, with saying this is also, relating to the global shift in power that is taking place as well. The rise of China, the multipolar world we are entering to, the global South that is now finding its own way and its own reason to develop its own relations in the way that it is wanted. And there are a lot of signs actually that allude to that fact. So yes, I think there is a lot of apprehension, but we are seeing that they're trying to manage it in the way that they can.
Thank you, Abdullah. We at the Middle East Institute, we take pride in the fact that, as the oldest think tank in America, would focus on the Middle East. We like to be a platform for exchange of ideas. So, for example, we recently published an article that actually came from Iran, and the viewpoint that was put out there by the academics who wrote the article they refer to the Persian Gulf region as one moment where, the Chinese, and they put Russian in the same camp. They refer to it as Asianization of the Persian Gulf. In other words, the West, that has been the dominant extra-regional power since Second World War, is gradually being pushed out. You mentioned relations between the Gulf states and the Arabs is one of sort of keeping the Russians pleased, but they're not necessarily that deeply involved with the Russians. But the Gulf states have a very different relations with the Chinese. That's their bread and butter when it comes to the economic well-being. I mean, somewhere like $600 billion worth of trade. So my question to you coming back in the next round is, could you see a situation where you have China, Russia, and Iran creating more of an anti-West, anti-US core? And would that not put the Gulf states in a bit of a awkward position given their long history of partnership with the United States? I'll come back to you on that, Abdullah. Thank you. Mahmoud, back to you. And the question I asked, the stubbornness that I've seen over the years when it comes to Russia in Iranian public opinion, and including many officials in the regime, is that stubborn view, that hesitance when it comes to Moscow, the lack of willingness to sort of bet on Russia as the key partner, is that eroding, or is that still pretty much there, but just not, we don't hear the voice as much?
If we kind of navigate the mindset of the top echelons in the Iranian political system, I think Iran is kind of torn between two impulses. On security grounds, the top leadership wants to pivot towards Moscow, and irrespective of historical contempt, because they see the continuity of the system with that kind of an evolving strategic relationship. You are right, there is no public support. Russia does not enjoy a positive image in Iran, and I think on that matter, China is in the same category. But on security grounds, the system has made the decision to pivot towards Moscow. But Iranian economic infrastructure, its banking, its commercial infrastructure is fundamentally European, and to some degree Japanese, and maybe on a limited ground American. So that's going to be a challenge into the future. But I think if we look at this evolving strategic relationship, Iran is a junior partner, and what brings the two countries together, probably at the conceptual level, is that they are both anti-American, and I think we should not overstate the defense cooperation between Iran and Russia, because what brings Russia into Iran when it comes to defense cooperation is the fact that Iran's weapon systems are very low cost, and they can furnish Russia with kind of cheap $20,000 drones. That's compared to 100,000, even more costly Russian missiles. So Iran is a junior partner. And Russia has always been interested historically. If we go back more than 2 centuries, Russian fundamental national interest has always been to keep Iran outside of the Western orbit, and that kind of invites Russia in bringing Iran into its kind of larger geographic proximity. So. Yes, there is opposition, particularly in the economic circles of Iran, and I'm not sure if this is going to be sustainable. But as long as the two leaders are in power, I think we can probably bet that the relationship will be sustained. But if there are changes in both countries, and there is a third supreme leadership in Iran, and if the economic paralysis in Iran continues, if the financial crisis in Iran is sustained, I'm not sure if this relationship can also be maintained. If Iran has invested in the persona of Putin, And we're not sure what will happen in Moscow in the coming years. Of course, Putin is up for re-election March of next year, and there is growing internal dissent in Russia. Russian domestic stability is in question. So the two leaders, I think, for the most part, have decided on this strategic relationship. What will happen, it will depend on domestic politics of both countries. Now, and there's also another point that is also relevant here, which kind of helps the security and military circles, the deep state in Iran. If this evolving Chinese and Russian economic relationship kind of expands, the de-dollarization of the Russian economy, and the fact that in 2022, 40% of Russian imports came from China, and 30% of Russian exports was directed to China. And there's been a demand for the Chinese currency, moving from 3% before the war now to 33%. So if there is going to be a balkanization of the global financial system, particularly in East Asia, Iran kind of hopes that it can also join economically into that larger de-dollarized financial system with Russia and China. Pakistan is also moving in that direction. Some Central Asian countries are moving in that direction. So if that's going to be, of course, examined, we don't know what will happen, but the deep state in Iran is hoping not only in security, but also economically, it can distance itself from Europe and the Western world by joining the macro China, Russia kind of commercial financial system in the future to guarantee the continuity of the system. But there will be, I think, outbursts within Iran at the public level, but more importantly, I think at the commercial and industrial and professional classes in Iran. That's going to be a challenge for the deep state in Iran, how it can convince the public. Just one last point. It is so interesting when we kind of navigate the media within Iran. Both the government and the top leadership, when they want to refer to the Russian question, they don't even talk about it. There's barely any discussion in Iran, any debate in Iran about the evolving Iranian Russian relationship. What they refer to is that the world is not just Europe and the United States. I think that's the dominant kind of cyber activity of Iran and the propaganda kind of machinery that is trying to promote that there's also this other world that we need to connect. But what is really interesting enough, and I've done this content analysis of the Iranian media over the last 5 months, there is barely any mention of Russia in the Iranian media and the national television. Even the top leadership does not mention Russia or China. They just mention that the world is too complicated and the world is changing. The political kind of atmosphere in the world is changing. Russia and China are in rise, and Iran needs to adjust and adapt itself to these new circumstances. So I think that kind of means that the top leadership does understand that it's going to be a very challenging kind of a foreign policy enterprise to push for a pro-Russian, pro-Chinese foreign policy in the near future.
Thank you, Mahmoud. You made a very good point. Many good points, but one of them that for me, I wanted to quickly comment on is the litmus test going forward right now in this Russian-Iranian relations. In many ways, is whether they can do much for each other in the economic area. One thing is to go around sanctions. Another thing is actually to create jobs. And just to give you a figure, I'm sure you know it, but for the audience, despite the fallout between Iran and the West and Europeans, last year, Iran still traded with the European Union bloc of 27 member states more so than it did with Russia. So that tells you that there's a lot of catching up to do if you're Russia and if you want to make friends with the Iranians on the economic front. And Anna, back to you. Any examples, as my question suggested, have you seen qualitatively, Russia and Iran doing things for each other in a more constructive manner when it comes to the region, from Syria to the South Caucasus?
Sure. And Alex, before I answer this question, very briefly, I wanted to pick up on a very important point that I thought Mahmoud had made earlier, and that is that Russia historically tried to keep Iran out of the Western sphere of influence. Indeed, a historic Russian state fear was that Iran would turn pro-Western. And that fear, in fact, superseded in the earlier years concerns about the Iranian nuclear program. In fact, and the second but related point to that relationship is that even in the early 1990s, when the US-Russia relationship was at its best, arguably, in the very early Yeltsin years, the one sticking point of the US-Russia relationship had specifically to do with Iran, with Russia's, it was at that point that Russia began supporting the Iranian nuclear program and selling weaponry to Iran. And so the reason why I bring this up now is because as we think about a potential post-Putin situation, as we talk about this relationship mainly between the leadership of the two countries, and certainly Russia is facing a lot of uncertainty. The point that I want to make is that even in what was probably the most pro-Western government that Russia had in the 1990s, Russian leadership had concluded that from a more practical perspective, rather than perhaps even necessarily out of an anti-American stance at that point, it was to Russia's advantage, a competitive advantage, to develop a commercial relationship with Iran. And I think that's an important point to remember as we think about what Russia would look like post-Putin. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, for me, it is a very complicated relationship, as we talked about, and a lot of it has to do with leadership, but it's not simply leadership. It is also the practical matter of where Russia is in the world and where its competitive advantage lies. And so to turn to your question about specific examples, specifically on Syria, what I've argued over the years is that Russia looking the other way at Israeli airstrikes in Syria, targeting pro-Iranian groups, was never the main. It was never the main goal. It was never the main strategic Russian interest, because these were foot soldiers, and certainly it was to Russia's advantage to some extent weaken Iran a little bit, in a sense that Russia wouldn't want any power becoming stronger than itself, and Iran included in that. So in that sense, the Iranian-Israeli strikes probably achieved that role, but also more importantly, what Russia wanted the most in Syria was first to keep Assad in power, mm-hmm. And second to push the United States and pro-American forces out of Syria. So what we're seeing unfolding in Syria right now is acceleration of normalization with the Assad regime. And that is something that Russia wanted. It is something that also doesn't cost Russia much in terms of investment. It is something that Russia has invested in politically, heavily, and diplomatically. So the normalization that we're seeing unfolding aligns with Russia's strategic goals in Syria. And in that sense, when we think about Russia's, there was some specific withdrawals of Russian forces in certain areas, but they were more tactical repositioning than anything strategic. And in terms of other key goals that Russia had that had to do with ensuring a potential reconstruction funds for the Assad regime. Again, the direction, at least the political direction that we're seeing unfolding, is aligned with Russia's goals. So in that sense, another thing to think about is the potential division of Syria's economic resources between Russia and Iran in Syria. To the extent that data is available and data is scarce, it does seem that Russia was able to get perhaps a better deal when it came to Syria's phosphate sector and maybe the tourism industry. But there's a lot of uncertainty here. A lot remains to be seen because there's a lot of triangulation between the Assad regime, Iran, and Syria. In that sense, everybody is triangulating against each other. But there's no fundamental strategic shift. In the South Caucasus, however, there's a lot going on, and it does have to do, a lot of it does have to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and perhaps Russia's either inability or lack of interest, a more specific decision to not intervene as it had in the past. The tensions that we're seeing developing between Azerbaijan and Iran in recent months have a lot to do with this dynamic. Russia historically has been a security guarantor to Armenia, but Russia also has close ties with Azerbaijan. And in most recent years, even prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has shifted closer to Azerbaijan. What Russia is working towards is rather than stepping in more actively, it's allowing things to unfold. It's allowing Iran to do more, possibly again out of desire to build a strategic relationship and develop the North-South corridor that transits the South Caucasus, and it is. But also because Azerbaijan simply has more to offer to Russia. Azerbaijan is a stronger economy, has a diversified foreign policy, energy resources, and so forth. So Russia is showing itself to be a poor ally to Armenia, but at the same time, it's still the only country that can talk to both sides. Because of these tensions remain ongoing, historically, I should say, this is my last point, historically, this region, the South Caucasus, I should say all of the Caucasus, North and South, along with Central Asia, tends to get most unstable in times of major upheaval in Russia. And that is what we're seeing unfolding today, major upheaval because of the enormous costs of the war in Ukraine. So that region will be very important to watch as the Ukraine war continues.
Thank you so much, Anna. We have about 20 minutes or so left. Before I turn to Abdullah, let me start bringing some of the questions in. Some of the questions have been answered by Mahmoud and Anna, but Mahmoud, here's a specific question for you. Can you elaborate on ways in which Russian intelligence could protect the succession process in Iran when it happens? I'll come back to you on that. And two quick questions for you here. How does the Iran-Russia relationship affect Israel? Again, you touched on some of that in the context of Syria, but here's another question. Will Russia help Iran become a nuclear weapon state? And Abdullah, back to you. You've been patient. I don't know if you want to react to what you heard Anna and Mahmoud say, or if you want to take me on to what my question in terms of what China and Russia and Iran, if that partnership becomes more of a military relationship, as we've seen in recent years, where more and more military exercises in the Gulf of Oman and so on, what that might do in the position of the Gulf states and in their act of balancing their various interests between the West and the non-Western world.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. If you allow me, I just want to echo what Mahmoud and Anna just said about the fact that Russia wants to keep Iran in its orbit and want to stop it moving towards the United States or the West. I also want to add to that I think it doesn't stop with Iran, it also extends to the whole Middle East. I think Russia is trying to keep the whole Middle East in its orbit. And it finds ways to do so in a very clever way. Basically pointing to where the West has let down the Middle Eastern countries. It talks about, the Arab-Israeli conflict. It talks about all the different areas where the West has been has kind of committed the Middle East to a benign neglect in many ways. And it uses that, and it actually touches the sensitivity of the people there, and it gets a lot of support for what it says. As you know, there is a lot of grievances in the Middle East. But to take you on your question, I think the Gulf states, the Arab states in general, are small states in a way. They are not states that they can see themselves competing at the international level. However, they find a way that they find a room where there is a multipolar world. And this multipolar world is still unfolding. And of course, you have Russia on one hand that we talked about, but you mentioned China, and China is a big player in this region. And as the economic gains for the Gulf states particularly, but also for the rest of the Middle East, is now much more aligned with China's Belt and Road policy and its investments in the region, and the amount of trade that is taking place, as you mentioned, that is already substantial. It even exceeded for the Gulf states, it exceeded the European Union, which used to be the main trading partner for the Gulf states. And in terms of investments, and not only into China, but also into the Middle East and into the Gulf states in particular. And if you take into consideration their economic policies, their wish to diversify their economies, they want to transit out of the hydrocarbon economy into a more sustainable economy. They see that their fortunes are actually with China more than anybody else at the moment. And therefore, they would like to have, and they are building good relationship with China, as we have seen during the President Xi visit to Saudi Arabia and the number of agreements that were signed. The summit that took place, there is a very strong likelihood that the China Gulf FTA, free trade agreement, is going to be signed, which is going to substantially change the numbers that, the volume that we are talking about now in terms of trade exchange and investments and technology transfer, etc. So what does it mean for the Gulf states, for the Arab states? Are they going to shift to one side or the other? I don't think so. I think these countries are sensible in the way that they know that their final security guarantor is the United States and the West. There have been, the guarantor for a very long period, and there is no other power that can guarantee the security of the region more than the United States. However, as small states always do, is they try to diversify their relations. They find agency, they find way of trying to balance their relationship with all the powers. So they don't want to be seen in one camp against the other, although sometimes they might tilt in this direction or that, but they try to rebalance very quickly. But I think they want to keep good relationship with their strategic partner, in this case, the United States, Western countries, and they see how important this is, being to their regime security, to their state security, etc. But at the same time, they don't want to lose out in this economic bonanza that's coming from China, and the economic rise of China, and the investment that is coming from China, and the know-how and technology, because Western investments comes and Western trade comes with lots of conditions, as you know. And China makes an offer or makes a model for them. It doesn't ask about, human rights. It doesn't talk about democracy. It doesn't have any conditions on the way that it trades with them, or it sells arms or sophisticated equipment, etc. So they see China as a partner. Also, the economic model that China has pursued, and that is, state-led economic model also kind of fits these Gulf states and meets their demand for diversification and for sustaining their economy. So in a nutshell, I think they want a balance. I know how this is not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, and sometimes they might get one party upset or another. But I think this is what they will try and do most of the time, and that is what most small states always do. They want to take advantage of what is going on in terms of Russia, China, Iran, and we've seen that Saudi Arabia is now just applied to become member of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and and there are other countries that are already doing so: Egypt, Qatar, etc. So this, they don't want to be left out, and they don't want to be put in one camp on the other, and of course it represents a challenge for them and also for their strategic partner.
Right. Thank you so much, Abdullah. We have time, just about under 10 minutes. We have time for one more round. So I'll come back to you, Abdullah, at the very end. But let me start with Mahmoud before I go to Anna. Mahmoud, the question of the role of Russian intelligence. Anything you can share with us?
Sure. First of all, we need to be mindful of the fact that Russia, going back more than 2 centuries, has always had an elaborate and highly networked intelligence presence in Iran, one of the most sophisticated, perhaps alongside the British in Iran. So this is not new. Russia, even I believe, played a major role during the Trump administration when Iran downed the American drone, and Russia did play an important intelligence role in that matter. So also keep in mind that Iran today has been accustomed to more than 3 decades of a particular leadership. When that leadership is terminated, Iran is going to go through a very difficult transition period. And that's going to be a volatile and also disturbing period. So there's going to be quite a bit of instability during that transition. So, and that's why I think continuity of the system is such an important objective for the top echelons. During that period, obviously the Western world, particularly the United States, is going to be trying to channel Iranian politics into a particular direction if it can. So Russian intelligence during that period on American or European, Western operations in Iran is going to help the groups, the individuals, the top echelons, how to go through the transition in a smooth and also in a stable manner is going to be critical. Now, let me also talk about a few things about whether or not this relationship is going to be stable. We should also keep in mind that Iran, I believe, cannot divorce itself economically from Europe in particular and the Western world in general. Currently, the number one national issue in Iran is economic stability, how to move forward with stable policies. Currently, we have a patchwork of contradictory economic policies. And so during this period of quite a bit of crises, Iran is trying to look for leverage, hedging, and it was kind of, and the withdrawal of the United States during the Trump administration kind of petrified the anti-Western inertia in Iran. So we can expect lots of changes during the transition period. And that would be my proposition for our panel. Look how Iran made a complete U-turn on Saudi Arabia. And that has been my argument over the last 34 years, that Iran is not an ideological state. Iran is seeking power and hegemony, and also is a country that is seeking to survive and continue as a state. So we can also expect U-turns on Russia and China policy, depending on internal dynamics, and also how, particularly during the transition period, Iranian domestic politics is going to unfold. But for the time being, I believe as long as the leaderships do remain in power in Iran and in Russia, this relationship is going to turn into a strategic one, and it's going to evolve. And perhaps during the Biden administration, it's going to be even consolidated. But after the Biden administration and after changes perhaps in Russia or Iran, I'm not sure if the pivot to Russia or China is going to be sustained within Iranian psyche and also Iranian domestic economic kind of trends, and also domestic politics.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Anna, there are those two questions on Russia helping Iran become a nuclear weapon state, and the issue of the impact of this Russian-Iranian relations on Israel.
Sure. And again, before I turn to those questions, if I may quickly react also to Mahmoud and Abdullah's comments. We talked about a multipolar world and these big global power shifts. I want to highlight that the very term multipolar world, or more specifically polycentric world, goes back, at least from a Russian perspective, from a Russian state perspective, to a man named Yevgeny Primakov, who was the Russian Foreign Affairs Minister starting in 1996. He took over from a more pro-Western predecessor, Andrei Kozyrev. Some commentators have described Primakov as Russia's Henry Kissinger. But certainly Primakov's biggest contribution was an articulation of a strategic vision of Russian foreign policy. And it was precisely a vision of a multipolar world, where there's Russia's pursuit of a multipolar world. And in that pursuit, Russia had to build a strategic triangle with China and India. A sub-point of that vision included Russia's return to regions where it played a prominent role prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, and that included the Middle East. And that goes to Abdullah's point about seeing the entire Middle East as part of its orbit, not simply Iran. And that also has to do with a far more longstanding Russia's historic perceptions of the so-called vulnerable South underbelly. In other words, perceiving itself as vulnerable in the South, and that included Central Asia, Caucasus, and the Middle East. It is a region where historically, for centuries, in fact, Russia worried about its strategic position perhaps more than in Europe. So that's sort of, and so it's striking that as we continue to use this term of a multipolar world, or more and more in the last year, it is something that the Russian leadership had pursued consistently for years as an alternative to the US-led global order, which in Russian view has disadvantaged it unfairly. And so to turn to your questions about Israel and helping Iran turn pro-nuclear. First, I think it's reasonable to expect that Russia will do more to help to contribute to the Iranian nuclear program, which it says is for peaceful purposes. Again, it has to do with the fact that historically, despite Russia's rhetoric of concerns of a nuclear Iran, in reality, Russia worried far more about Iran turning pro-Western. I remember reading comments from Russian officials or former officials in the early 2000s that even described it in the following way: that in the West, there are lobbies that push for certain interests. But in Russia, no such tradition exists, and it's only what the Russian state wants to do. And there was certainly no internal push within Russia to limit, to sort of raise more alarm bells about the Iranian nuclear program. Russia never perceived the Iranian program with the same degree of concern as the West had. Another piece of that perception is that Russia had always lived with a number of nuclear powers in its neighborhood. And if Iran were to go nuclear, it would simply be one more. But if Iran were pro-Western, that would worry that would completely change Russia's calculus. But if Iran was pro-Russian, then certainly there would be no need to worry about a nuclear Iran. You know, we can think of it the same way. We have allies in the West that are also nuclear, but we don't worry about their use of nuclear power because they're allies, and we know that they will not use it for nefarious purposes. So I think it's a reasonable concern, and that's why there have been comments over the last several months about concerns within the American intelligence community of what Russia could potentially do to aid the Iranian nuclear program. On Israel, again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put Israel in a very difficult position for obvious reasons. It's a democracy, a liberal democracy in the Middle East. It's part of the liberal family of nations. It was built on these values, and a large number of immigrants had come to Israel from Ukraine and Russia and other parts of the Soviet Union. From the Russian perspective, will Russia limit? Will Russia interfere with Israeli strikes? To date that has not happened, but certainly there's been a change in Russian rhetoric towards Israel, and it had to do with threatening the Jewish population in Russia, sort of kind of holding it as hostage almost. From a rhetorical perspective, there were a number of court proceedings against the main Jewish organizations in Russia. But again, it's an issue that's dragging. So it seems to be simply a political message to Israel. And that's something that worries Israel. And the second, again, is going back to the Russian position in Syria. It is something that worries Israel. Russia could potentially close the skies if it wanted to. One thing to think about is as Russia, in a scenario where Russia's military power erodes, could the threat of the S-400 umbrella simply no longer become credible? We're not quite there yet, I don't think. I think it is a credible threat at this stage, but it is a possibility that could change. Russia still wants to be seen as a mediator in the region, and that is why I think closing the space to Israel would be a fairly dramatic step. Something really drastic would have to happen. So I think that is unlikely, but it is another Damocles sword that Russia holds over Israel.
Thank you so much, Anna. Abdullah, we're over time, but you are going to get the last word. And I'm going to lump two questions together. One is, how is the Chinese brokered agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran viewed in the Gulf states? And another question touches on the information that has come out of late on potential Egyptian willingness to support Russia militarily. But could you maybe tie all those two issues in a broader sort of framework of, because you mentioned the United States is going to be the security guarantor for the region in the foreseeable future for certainly the smaller Gulf states. But if you're advising the United States policymakers, Abdullah, what is it that they need to do in terms of not just being the security guarantor, but also start competing with the Chinese on the economic front? You talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, state-led efforts that, United States is a democracy. You can't get companies out there invest if they don't want to. But are there alternatives for the United States, not just to occupy the role as a security guarantor, but actually the entity that can come in, create jobs the way the Chinese are saying they can do? Last word, Abdullah.
Okay, I'll try and make it brief, Alex. But first of all, I think we need to think about the Gulf states as not necessarily a unitary unit, in the sense that each Gulf state had its own foreign policy, and many countries in the Gulf have already had good relations with Iran. Economic relations, economic exchange. United Arab Emirates and Iran, of course, the relationship is well known. Qatar has good relationship with Iran, Kuwait to a certain extent, and of course Oman. The conflict was mainly between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that is they're both of them vying for kind of regional dominance. And one can understand that. Bahrain is, of course, because of its own internal issues, the Shia majority there and the support that they get from Iran against the regime, especially during the Arab Spring. So Bahrain and Saudi Arabia were in one camp against Iran, and they were kind of hawkish, while the others were, there is a lot of ambivalence between them, but at least they had some good cooperation with Iran. And as you know, Oman was instrumental in the GCPA discussions that led to the GCPA discussions and so on. So when the agreement took place, when the agreement happened, I think it was welcomed mainly by the Gulf states, because it makes their relationship with Iran much more open, much more easier, and they obviously want to work and interact with Iran, and they see opportunities there in many ways, and they see that this conflict that is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it actually harms them in a number of respects, including, of course, the security of the maritime and their shipping of their oil and gas to the rest of the world. So it was welcomed, and we have to remember that the agreement and the talks were initiated apparently in Oman, and then in Qatar, and then in Iraq. But China was given the role of the broker for good reasons, obviously, because it has to be a global power. And of course, given the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States now, and especially with the current administration, it was difficult. And of course, Russia is involved in a war, so it couldn't kind of broker or be seen as brokering this agreement. So it was given to China, and also it's recognizing its importance in the region. As far as what the United States could do, I think the United States could do a lot more in the region, and it should go beyond this just military cooperation and military and providing security, which is of course needed. But the United States and the West have been very reluctant in terms of course, investing in the region and building and helping the region to diversify away from oil and gas. There are a lot of plans and visions in the region that they need investment and know-how and technology, and there are a lot of restrictions on technology transfers, especially when it comes to sensitive issues that some of the Gulf states want to do, especially when it comes to military technology. From the view from the Gulf, from the region, is that the United States just views the region as a market for their arms sales and in exchange for security. I don't want to comment so much on the other question about Egypt, simply because it's still a leaked information. It's not confirmed yet. And of course, that leaked information has also implicated other countries, including, as you know, the UAE as well. But it's still a leaked information that is not confirmed. But it does actually raise a lot of questions if this is true, given that Egypt is a major recipient of U.S. aid, and for it to do so, I think it will be problematic in its future relationship with the U.S. But as I said, this is only intelligent leaked information that is not yet proven, and until it's proven, we can't. It's too early to comment on that.
Thank you, Abdullah. Look, we've gone over by about 10 minutes, just under, but we could have stayed here and probably had another hour easy. This has been such a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Abdullah. You've been giving us so much to think about. I go away, my conclusion from hearing you speak today is, despite the history of ups and downs in Iranian Russian relations, as long as we have the leadership we have in Moscow and Tehran, for now, we're in the direction of going towards strategic cooperation. But who knows what's going to come when there is a change in leadership, because there are issues that actually don't provide a good fit for that kind of strategic alliance between the two countries. And in the meantime, the Arab world is going to balance its interests and hope that they don't get dragged in any sort of Russian-Iranian ventures that might impact their interests. But anyway, all that said, thank you again for joining us today. Thanks for all those wonderful questions that came in. And we look forward to hosting you at the Middle East Institute for another panel on another equally, I'm sure, interesting topic relating to the Middle East.